Hi, it's Michael Senoff with Michael Senoff's HardToFindSeminars.com. The title of this interview is called The Average Guy's Guide to the Licensing Game. How to use it to start a business, expand a business, or just make money quickly. Licensing is a creative game with very little boundaries or limitations. Known as the poor man's advertising, it can give enormous media exposure to even the smallest of businesses by leveraging off the popularity of movies, events, or brands. Licensing crosses over into all markets, can easily launch a product, expand a business, make a career, or create a household name overnight. In this two-part seminar, you'll hear all about it from licensing expert Rand Brenner. Rand's been in the licensing game since the early days when even huge corporations were still guessing at how to make money off of it. He's helped Warner Brothers Studios successfully license the first Batman movie and also helped Saban Entertainment make it huge with the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers brand. And in this interview, Rand shares his biggest and easiest secret techniques he's learned along the way, making it big in licensing intellectual property. Rand demystifies the truth about how to use licensing as a shortcut to success, even if you're on a shoestring budget. According to Rand, timing is everything when it comes to licensing. So in part one, you'll hear ways to look down the horizon and identify licensing opportunities before the competition. You'll also hear an overview of licensing with specific examples of how even the smallest of companies can use licensing every day to expand their business and break into new territories. Here's some of the key points of what you're going to learn. Examples of intellectual property licensing. 5 quick start steps for using it to make money. A can't-miss way to get started. How to present yourself when putting licensing agreements together. How to start with no prior experience. Everything you need to find intellectual properties to license. Licensing versus selling. The truth about both. Exploding the education myth with IP licensing. Steps to go from zero to making money in licensing in 90 days. Real-life insights into identifying lucrative licensing opportunities. What your first move should be once you find a product to license. The surprising reason why you don't have to be a lawyer. If you'd like more information on Rand's complete product line on licensing, go to www.licensingsecrets.com. That's www.licensingsecrets.com. Don't forget that extra com. Thanks for listening. Now let's get going. Tell me a story how maybe a guy in his garage took advantage of this Batman license and what was going on with it when you were on the scene there.
You know, my background is coming out of the entertainment industry. I spent a number of years at Warner Brothers Consumer Products, and then I was there at the time they launched the first Batman movie, which was a very interesting story. Many people are probably very familiar with Batman through the generations of the comic book.
They had TV shows at that time, right?
Well, Batman was one of the first to come on from the comic books, if you will. And then you saw a lot of other types of shows that came on. There was, I don't know if you remember this, the Green Hornet TV show for a little while. Then you saw the Incredible Hulk in the 70s. And these were all offshoots from these comic books that had been around, in many cases, 5 and 6 decades, because many of these characters that we're talking about actually got started in the 1930s, some of them even as long ago as the 20s. But they built their primary awareness and audience was through these comic books. And they became very, very well known, especially to, if you want to call it, the older generations, in which comic books at one time, as it evolved in the 30s and 40s and 50s, were very, very big forms of entertainment, if you will. And there was a lot of stores, and people used to hang out in comic book stores. So Batman became well recognized as a character, but at that time DC was still operating as an independent company. By the time the movie was produced, it had been acquired by Warner Brothers. It was becoming part of a very large conglomerate. And so the idea for the movie actually had been around at the studios for almost 5 years prior to it ever reaching the big screen, I think. And interestingly enough, the previous comic book character who had been the most well-known on TV was Superman. They produced 5 of them, and it was interesting because they had developed those. Fascinating history, but there was a company known at that time as Licensing Corporation of America. Licensing Corporation of America had a long history. They represented Warner Brothers for Looney Tunes. They also represented Major League Baseball, and I think at one time they also represented hockey. Many people don't realize Major League Baseball itself did not have its own licensing division. Licensing of entertainment context, sports leagues, and all this really was a business that really didn't get started until the late 80s. And many people don't realize that because up until that point, a lot of these entertainment properties, if you will, whether it's a movie or a sporting event made made their movie in what was then the business model, that of selling tickets and popcorn and peanuts. This licensing thing was really, oh, go talk to somebody in the back room at the marketing department if you want to make a toy or a T-shirt, because nobody thought that there was really any money in it. It wasn't even a blip on the radar screen, and you'd be hard-pressed to have met anybody who was doing licensing. It was usually an assistant in the marketing department somewhere, or it was always relegated to the back room because, again, there was no recognition by many of these sports leagues or entertainment companies that there was any value in licensing merchandise and selling it at retail. It wasn't on the radar screen at that time.
How about Disney, Walt Disney? Didn't they have a handle on it?
They were the most active in licensing, but their division was small at that time. Even Disney merchandise, for the most part, you didn't see it as extensively in the market back then as you do now. Most of their licensing evolved around their theme parks. And so they really weren't doing anything. And many of the other studios, for the most part, I can tell you through my friends and associates, were acting as agents and independent consultants if, in fact, there was any licensing going on. It was just one of these things that was handed off to somebody in the marketing department or someplace that said, look, we get these phone calls every now and then from companies that say, hey, can I use the rights to this movie or TV show to put on my T-shirts or toys? So at any rate, with the first Batman movie, the studio had decided to make a concentrated effort around licensing, and so they've moved the division out, and they had to go find people to staff it. And so they brought in people from advertising and marketing and various places, and it was one of those things where literally we joined the licensing division. We were handed a telephone, and they said, go license this to somebody.
So you guys were selling licenses. You were hustling.
We were hustling for licenses, and this is what makes the story interesting. As we were out there trying to license Batman, every major manufacturer that we talked to said, we're not interested. This Batman is just this comic book character. Superman had just been done. We don't see any value in it. We don't want the license.
What's your sales pitch? If you're calling these guys, what are you telling them? What's the big promise when you're making cold calls?
Well, that's always a fascinating question because sometimes you're working with limited information. I will say this. I guess it's one of the inside stories at the studio. The licensing division was really the stepchild of the studio. And by that I mean there was no division anywhere that wanted anything to do with us. We were considered the pariahs, that we would take this artwork that was being developed by production and we would grossly commercialize it. So we literally were working out there with no support from anybody. And so what we had to do is we had to scrape together any information that we could, and we would basically find leads, make cold calls, go to trade shows, and start talking to companies about the fact that there's this movie coming out called Batman. And basically, would you be interested in licensing it for shorts or T-shirts or whatever it is? And that's literally the way it ran.
But you couldn't promise it was going to be a huge hit. You know, that's the thing. You're selling a potential hit.
That's it. And nobody even really knew. That's where it got really interesting because you had major toy companies and other manufacturers who were very large in the market, and they took a look at it, and their assessment of it is we're not going to risk our investment on these entertainment projects, especially from comic books, because we just don't see any market for it. At that time, they had very well-established brands of their own, be it boys' toys or girls' toys or whatever it is. And at that time, too, there were many more toy companies that were out there, many more retailers. So they did not view it, as did many retailers, as any kind of really viable brand at that point.
All right, let me ask you this. Let's say you've got a listener, and he's approaching an entertainment property or some license that could be a long shot. So you're saying no one was interested. How good of a deal, if you had called me on the phone and said, Mike, do you want a T-shirt license on the Batman character, what kind of deal could I have gotten at that time?
There were people that picked up Batman for about $2,500 and about an 8% royalty.
You mentioned categories. Explain to the listener, are there hundreds of different categories? Is it standardized now?
Well, now it's a lot more, but when I refer to categories, I'm really talking about product categories. Toys, apparel, food, beverage, electronics, household goods, sporting goods, musical instruments. Those are what are generally referred to as product categories.
So for $2,500, I could have gotten a license. Give me an example for clothing.
Well, for example, you may have gotten a license and said, geez, you know, I can make some T-shirts and hats and headbands.
And I would have the absolute exclusive license on hats, T-shirts, and headbands.
Well, now, generally, licenses are not written as exclusives, and there's a lot of reasons that they're not. But you would have received the license. It would have been a non-exclusive license. I'll caveat that by saying that most of the time in entertainment, even in sporting goods, it's non-exclusive, but in the negotiations it's discussed that there won't be other direct competitors licensed. It's not in anybody's interest to have two of the same thing on the market.
I see. So generally today, companies don't license exclusives unless it's just, a huge deal.
Exactly.
Tell me about this little bike story, a story about an unknown family and a company that had been producing bicycles.
That's one of many stories, but it's interesting. Again, it's one of these stories where you've got some entrepreneurs, they've got a little bike company, it's been operating as a family.
What do you mean bike company? They manufacture bicycles?
Tricycles, kids' bicycles. At that time, they made a lot of the low-cost bikes. Distribution was starting to open up. At that time, Walmart was still building, so they did a lot of work with Kmart and Target and places like that.
Was this a deal you got on your own?
It's a combination of factors. Warner Brothers, we went out to the licensing show, which at that time was in New York at the Javits Center. It was very small at the time. And we were sending out PR releases just to get the word out, okay, so people knew we had this property. And so as a result of going to trade shows, this company happened to get some information, and so they called up the studio, and they were referred over to me since that was the category I was handling. And basically they were interested in getting a license for something. We hadn't talked about anything, and we said, great. And they set up an appointment, said they'd like to come in and discuss. And prior to that, of course, they sent out a few samples of what they made, water bottles, and they sent a catalog with the bikes, and we said, okay, fine, come on in. And basically it was one of the brothers who owned the company, and they came in and we started talking, and we talked about the fact that we had this Batman movie. And they took a look at it, and they thought, okay, why not? Batman bike, sure, we could do that. And so I think our deal was $2,500 or $3,000, and they decided, okay, we'll make some of these bikes for kids at about 10 or 12-year-olds, two-speed bikes, and we'll soup them up. We'll put some stickers on them and make them in black, and we'll make them look really cool.
For more exclusive interviews on business, marketing, advertising, and copywriting, go to Michael Senoff's hardtofindseminars.com. Okay, let me ask you this. Now, you selling the license, you guys were pretty desperate. He made these bikes. Really, there wasn't too much qualifying you had to do. You knew he manufactured bikes. You were desperate to sell licenses. So how much qualifying did you have to do to be able to take his money and agree to the license?
It's interesting that you raise qualifications. Everything changes. Success breeds maturity in anything. So initially, I'd say the folks that came in, were able to pretty much qualify to get a license with minimal qualifications. The fact that they were a viable company, they had product, they could demonstrate that they had some distribution somewhere, pretty much qualified them to get a license.
Okay, but as the licensor, you knew you're taking a chance with all these licensees. There's no guarantee that they're going to be able to sell tons and tons of bikes. But if they do great, it's all a risk, right, on both sides?
It is a risk on both sides. And you bring up a really interesting point when it comes to this, because really in the licensing business, timing is everything. And it's one of these stories that I share with people that because of the situation, because Batman wasn't being perceived as a viable property, because the studio was somewhat desperate to get licenses, these companies were able to come in and basically take, for them it was a risk in the fact that they're going to put money down and make this product. For the studio, they were just looking to populate the licensee list, which is the terminology. The studio at the time, populate the licensee list so that they could go and provide something to the producers to let them know that we had something going on. So it was an opportunity, and the opportunity was for these small companies who basically came in and said, okay, we'll take a shot on it. And by virtue of a series of factors that were going on in timing, you didn't have to have a lot to be able to qualify for these licenses.
Hi, it's Michael Senoff with hardtofindseminars.com. Thanks for watching this video. Many of my interviews last 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, sometimes even up to 2.5 hours long. They're actual mini seminars, and you've just listened to a short sample of just one of over 117 hours of exciting, hard-hitting, mind-blowing interviews on how to make money in direct mail, advertising, copywriting. I assure you, there is not a resource anywhere on the internet or on the planet that comes close to the free information I provide at hardtofindseminars.com. So go right now to hardtofindseminars.com, and you'll have free access to 117 hours of audio interviews with typed word-for-word downloadable transcripts and downloadable MP3 files. Please browse some more of the videos or go right directly to hardtofindseminars.com. Thanks for watching.